Matt Jarvis says, I was reading a couple of articles in rebuttal to some ranting by a SJW, that'd be a social justice warrior, proclaiming people of color, which sounds so much like colored people to me, should only read books or take seriously the opinion of insert either race, gender, LGBT, whatever here, instead of white men that happen to write books and such. Isn't social justice warrior just another term for pissed off Nazi that wants to tell everybody what they are doing fun wrong? They're not just fascists, these little kids who want to ban the works of white writers because they're black and they should therefore only read black literature. You can certainly make the case, and I think it's a fair case to say, that for many years the contributions of people, of black writers or Asian writers or whatever, have been somewhat undervalued, and that opening up literature to voices that may not have been recognized earlier is, of course, a good thing for everybody, not just for black students, but for white students. If there are black authors of merit who have interesting things to say about the human condition, who have not been taught or discovered, then I benefit by them being taught or discovered. With that simple caveat out of the way, it is a form of control. It's a form of childishness. It's a form of perpetual victimhood. It's basically saying, I'm only going to read black authors because only black authors can understand my condition. Really, Snowflake? Your condition today in Yale, only a black author like Frederick Douglass can understand your position of hardship in a university that you attend for $100,000 a year, and your $600 toys, and your life of leisure in Uber, and please. But it's even deeper than that. If you're saying that you're only going to read black authors, let's just say, life is not just literature, If you're only going to read black authors, you're not going to know anything about Isaac Newton. You're not going to know anything about gravity. You're not going to know anything about relativity. You're not going to know anything about germ theory. You're not going to know anything about pasteurization. You're not going to learn anything about inoculation. You're not going to learn anything about penicillin. You're not going to learn anything about most archaeology. You're not going to learn much about anything. And your world will get smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller and smaller. Listen, reality is reality. White men have achieved most of the achievements in this society, in any society. You don't have to like it. It's just true. It doesn't mean only white men have done it, and it doesn't mean only men have done it, but the vast majority of the things that we are based our lives on today have been accomplished by white men. Does that mean that it shouldn't change in the future? Well, what it means is, in the future, if white men had excluded women, if white men had excluded black men or black women, that exclusion has to stop. And it's in everybody's interest that it stops. If there are black geniuses, women geniuses, Chinese geniuses out there who've been deprived a chance to have a voice or research funds or whatever, then it's my interest as a white man to have these people succeed. And it's my interest as a white man for them to have literature that's worthy, interesting, and timeless, and it would be to my advantage to read these things. But if you're basically going to say that you need to read a book who's written by a black author in place of Shakespeare because he's black and he's written something of relatively low value, then the only person you're cheating is yourself. So go ahead and cheat yourself. If you only want to read about black scientists, then just read about black scientists. And if you only want to read about black science as discovered by black science, knock yourself out. But your life is going to be limited, and you are not going to have any opportunity to succeed in anything like that. And that's why you don't hear it from people who go on to be engineers, and you don't hear this kind of whiny, victim-y nonsense from anybody who's half serious. You don't hear nurses talking about things like this. You don't hear engineering students who may be Asian or black or whatever, or gay. You don't hear sensible, serious people saying things like this. The only people who say things like this are people who have literature degrees or who have studies in victimology. I am a woman's study major. That's the kind of person who would make a statement like that. My degree is in black history. Swell. You might make a kind of statement like that. But somebody who has to survive in the world with a useful degree can't just not afford to block out white male authors. You can't afford to block out any authors. If you plan to succeed out there and somebody's got something interesting to say about it, you ought to read what they have to say. And we get to the deeper issue now, which is this kind of, it's a black thing you can't understand. I am willing to say that there are things about being black in America that I cannot relate to immediately, that don't affect me, that I haven't had on my radar, experiences that I may have colored my perspective. I'm certainly willing to admit that. But the idea that I cannot understand it is a lie. If a skillful enough black author were to write a book explaining what it means to be black in America, then I could understand it. I could sympathize with it. I could sympathize with it to the degree that I can sympathize with any other piece of literature like Mark Twain or Hamlet or anything else. Hamlet is not about a white guy in Denmark, for God's sakes, you miserable lowlife idiots. Hamlet is not about what a white Danish prince does with a decision. Hamlet is what you do with a decision. Hamlet is what every single human being has to grapple with as it comes time to deal with a decision of monumental importance. And that's why we know who William Shakespeare is. It's not because he's given advice to young white Danes who lived 400, 500, 600 years ago. It's because his writings are so profound that the story of a white Dane who lived 500 years ago is relevant to this very second and day, because he's captured the essence of the human condition, which doesn't change. Now, if you have large numbers of black authors can do that, then they should be read by everybody, not just by black students, by white students, because if that kind of author can capture that kind of experience, they need to be read for my personal benefit and yours as well. But unfortunately, that's not the case. It may have been a historical aberration, in which case, by all means, let's open the doors to people of that level of talent, but it doesn't mean that we have to throw away works that are timeless and immortal for perfectly good reason in order to read junk, just because it happens to be written by a guy who's Asian or black or gay. I'm not saying that everything that Asians, black, or gays write is junk. I'm saying exactly nothing like that. I am saying that if you're going to throw away a classic in exchange for junk, that's not a good trade. There's many, 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 many more white authors who've written Drek than there are black authors who have written Drek. Many, 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 many more. So, to say that I'm going to give up on Shakespeare because he's an old white male is to deprive yourself of the single greatest insight into the human condition that has so far lived upon the earth. That doesn't mean that the next person who can do it won't be black or mixed or Hispanic or gay or a woman or all of them together. It just means so far the deepest insight into the human psyche has not just come from one work, by the way. If all he wrote was Hamlet, he'd be immortal. But the human condition in every one of his plays, and the reason so many Shakespearean phrases have worked their way into common language 600 years after they were written, 600 years after they're written, is because of their essential ability to apply to anyone. A black student sitting in Africa in a thatched hut today should be able to read Hamlet and be able to get the same emotional response as a guy who was a Danish prince in a castle at the time it was written, although obviously it happened before, at the time that Shakespeare wrote it. It should be as relevant to a black 14-year-old child in a hut in Africa as it is to a guy who's a Danish prince in the year 1875. They should get the same pretty much experience out of it, and that's why Shakespeare is Shakespeare. Not because he was writing from the perspective of a white Danish prince, but because he was writing from the perspective of the eternal elements of humanity that do not change and apply to everybody. Now, if you want to deprive yourself of that, I can't really stop you in the same way that I can't stop you from eating or drinking either, but if you want to starve yourself to prove a point, that's called a hunger strike. And if you want to just deprive yourself of nutrition until you starve, that's fine. And there's that. So that's basically the argument I want to make. But since I'm in a mood, let's make another argument. If you want to tell me that a wooden mask from an African culture or a South American culture or a New Guinea culture, or a wooden mask made by Mongolians, or a wooden mask made by American Indians, or a wooden mask made by Bronze Age white people, if you want to tell me that a wooden mask that's hacked out of a piece of wood is the exact same level of art as the statue of David, you're wrong. They're not equal. They're both art, but they're not equal. If you want to tell me that a totem pole hacked together by an American Indian, or the finest product of art of the whitest people who lived in Europe 2,000 years ago is equal to Michelangelo's statue of David, you're wrong. And the reason you're wrong is because which one do you think you could make? Which one do you think most people could make? Which one do you think is harder to make? In other words, if you are talking about hacking a piece of wood and putting in eyes and smearing some red paint on it and doing all these other things on a tribal level, if you think that that is harder or equally hard as seeing inside a block of the hardest substance known at the time, the form of a person who is so perfect that you can see the veins in his marble skin, if you think that these things are equal, then you're just an idiot. You're really, 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 really broken if you think these things are equal. They're not equal. I didn't sculpt the statue of David, and I'm not Greek. Was Michelangelo a white guy? Yes, so what? He was. But I don't get credit for him. He's Greek. He lived hundreds of years ago. He's Italian. I'm sorry, I kept saying Greek. I didn't mean to say Greek. He's Italian. Of course he's Italian. I didn't mean to say Greek. Sorry about that. He's Italian. And I don't own him. He doesn't belong to me. He belongs to all of us. Somebody makes it. You know what I am? I'll tell you where I was going to go with this, and I am going to go with this kind of degree of programming, because people hear this and they say, oh, yeah, I know where you're coming from. Let me say this. If you listen to rap today, or if you want to listen to the best music that I could compose, if you were to give me Mr. White American Male with all of my privilege, and if I had unlimited amounts of funds and I had millions of dollars and I went into a recording studio and I just sat there for years and years and years and had to make my own music would come a long, 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 long way short of the music of Scott Joplin, let's say. If you listen to Solace by Scott Joplin, if you listen to the emotion and the subtlety that he captures with just a piano, that's inachievable by me, and it's unachievable by virtually every white male in existence alive today. If you listen to Thelonious Monk, if you listen to Charlie Parker, but I love Joplin for some reason. I don't know what it is about Joplin, but ragtime became the name of an age because of a kind of music that I don't want to say he wanted invented, but he so dominated ragtime that they named an entire decade after him. If you listen to Scott Joplin's music and you listen to this is the thing. This is what I was saying a few moments ago about Shakespeare. I can listen to Scott Joplin today 100 years after he died, and he's a black man from 100 years ago, and he's speaking to me. He's not just speaking to black people. He's speaking to me, and I hear him, and I get it, and I'm enriched by it. And to say that, well, I'm not going to listen to Scott Joplin because he's black and I'm white, and I only listen to white authors, or I only listen to white musicians, is as ridiculous as what these people are saying. Really? Honestly? You really think that's the case? You really think the world would be better off without Scott Joplin, or better off without Thelonious Monk, or better off without Charlie Parker, or better off without Michael Jackson, or better off without any of these black artists? You really think that my life would be improved by not listening to them and only listening to white musicians? How ridiculous does that make me sound? How absolutely upside down and ridiculous does that make me sound? It makes me sound like an idiot, because I would be. And that's what these people are. They just want to wear the crown of thorns of victimhood. And they want to show everybody how outraged they are, because they're not allowed to compete. They're not allowed to compete in sports. They're not allowed to compete economically. They're not allowed to compete in any other way except who can be the biggest victim and who can wear the bloodiest crown of thorns. And that's what this whole thing is all about. You couldn't understand it. It's a black thing. You couldn't understand it. Really? I understand Hamlet. I understand Joplin. I understand Joplin as well as you understand Joplin. As a matter of fact, I understand Joplin much better than you understand Joplin, you 20-year-old black student. I understand him much better than you do, because I've been through enough in life to know what he's writing about. I know in that song, Solace, I know what he's trying to say. I know what he's trying to say to me. I am far, far, far more able to process what this black man 100 years ago wrote for me than you are. Because it's got nothing to do with being black. It's got to do with being human. And that's where you're deficient, young lady. And you're determined to keep yourself as deficient as you possibly can be. Yeah, let's go.